Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this conversation with Purdue University President Mitch Daniels on leadership in higher education. And I want to say that it's really on behalf of everyone at AEI, not only myself, but all of our scholars, all of our friends, that we welcome Governor Daniels here today. He is one of our great heroes and someone we really have followed and respected and loved for a very long time. And I'm also very happy that we have our chairman, Dan Daniello, to show that same sort of affection and respect for a great American leader. And I should also point out that, you know, AEI scholars host lots of events like these, but they only let me come down to introduce our guests when it's someone really important. At OMB, in the governor's offices, and at Purdue, Mitch Daniels has really set an example on how to be a great thinker, a man of action, a public man. And so we're very, very pleased to have him. And I do also want to point out that I've been following him for a long time. When I was a young, up-and-coming administrator in the Social Services Agency in New York State, we were doing some things that we thought were pretty innovative and important in welfare policy. And I noticed that there was an article in which Mitch was quoted when he was at OMB in the Bush administration about the importance of doing things like we were doing in New York. And I felt that I wanted to write him and let him know that you know, some statistics about what we'd achieved under Governor Pataki in New York. And so I sent him a letter, and within a week and a half, I got a handwritten note back. And it was very brusque. It said, "Robert, we are very aware of what's going on in New York." I assure you. To help us in this conversation, I also want to introduce, and she'll come up later after Governor Daniels speak, Beth Akers, who has really been an outstanding scholar on important issues for us. And I just want to say that I believe that when you look at the scholars and critics and commentators who've talked about higher education financing in the United States, there's no one better than Beth. So we're going to have a great presentation. We start with you, Governor Daniels, and then you and Beth will have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you all. My first, not by a long shot, my first opportunity to visit with the brilliant people of AEI, but my first time in this remarkable facility with all the history that's here and the history I know is being made here by each of you every day. And I'll simply say that anything certainly that I knew about higher ed or thought I did when I arrived there now 10 years ago, never having lived in that world, I probably learned from an AEI paper somewhere or other. And that has continued to be a source of information and insight to me ever since. So thanks for all you do on that and every other front. Please know that I'm among your most avid consumers. I want to get rather quickly to the important part of the conversation, which will be Beth's questions and yours. Let me try to just get us there in this summary way. I was being interviewed fairly early in my current job, and somebody asked me what our objectives were, what our hopes were for the institution that I serve. And off the cuff, really, I said, well, I would sum it up by saying that we're out to deliver higher education at the highest proven value. And for 8 or 9 years, or however long it's been since then, I've not been able to fashion a formulation that I like any better, or that is certainly that is any more concise. What was I thinking about? Well, value is the most important word in the little aphorism. And as I've explained on our campus and elsewhere ever since, that has to do with that's the most common equation of life, really. Value, meaning quality over price. Been a lot of attention paid in our case to the denominator because we've taken pains to keep the cost of a Purdue education within reach. Many people don't know this, and sometimes I don't want them to know this, but we're a public land-grant university. I go a lot of places, especially I get to Asia, they think we're a private elite university. Some of them think we're an Ivy League university. I don't dispel that impression. But in fact, we are deeply imbued with the land-grant ethic, which we were placed there, of course, by Abe Lincoln and his allies we and all our counterpart schools to throw open the doors of higher education. And we work very hard on that. Part of that is, we believe, to be as affordable and accessible as we can be. And I can sum that up for you by reporting that by holding tuition unchanged for 10 years, next year will be the 11th, and it's already in the books, and also reducing slightly the cost of room, board, and books. It is less expensive in nominal dollars to attend our university now than it was in 2012. And so that's unusual, to say the least, in higher ed, and gets a lot of attention. But I try never to let that conversation happen without equally emphasizing the numerator, that is to say, quality. And if anybody's curious about this subject, I'll go into it later, but just simply to assure you that we have invested very heavily in the quality. We've grown the faculty in lockstep with the growth of the student body. The student body has grown 30% over that time. And we have invested likewise in facilities and so forth. So the second most important word in the little answer I gave is proven. And here, I suggest there's a lot of work for somebody to do, maybe somebody at this outstanding institution. When people ask why the heck did tuition run up as it did, everyone here I'm sure knows the only three aspects in the Consumer Price Index that went up faster than healthcare over the last 20, 30 years are college tuition, college room and board, and college books. How'd that happen? A lot of explanations, but this, to me, the essence of it is that there was no quality measure. People didn't know whether an English major at school A had really mastered the language and the facility with it more than someone who studied at school B, whether an engineer from school C really could build a better, safer bridge more affordably than the counterpart from some other place. And therefore, it's pretty well established now, people associated sticker price with quality. If it costs more, it must be better. And along with many other factors, of course, the biggest one being the ever-increasing amount of subsidy that the federal government and sometimes state governments were applying. To lubricate the whole process, it's began to run on its own motor. So I would say, and we've taken steps at our school to try to identify to ourselves, and we are sharing it with our fellow citizens, with applicants, and the world. What we hope will be, and what the data now tell us, is intellectual growth of our students. This isn't easy to get at. Been a lot of different instruments attempted. We tried 3 before we got one that we thought was reliable. But this is to measure so-called critical learning, critical thinking. But I'm happy that there's been a lot more concentration on value in recent years, that more and more scholars, as well as lay press and others, have begun to look more closely at, for instance, what salaries are graduates of one school earning compared to people studying the same subject in some other school. That's interesting too. But higher ed will begin to deliver better for this country if and when accountability comes through better, more reliable measurements of its performance. And So I just submit that to this particular audience because some of the finest people who could be and have in some ways addressed that in the past are here. I want to start the questioning, but I'll just leave you with the thought that no question you're about to ask about shortcomings in the system is likely to come as a surprise, nor is it likely to be something I'll quarrel with. The system has very serious flaws, which many of you have chronicled over the course of time. All that said, I think we have a very strong national interest in maintaining, or in some cases rebuilding, what is still considered, I think, fairly, the finest network of higher education institutions in the world. And so I do disagree with those, and I know many people of this kind who have just thrown up their hands about the whole enterprise and want to walk away, and that I think would be a great mistake. So I appreciate the chance to be here. I never have a problem eliciting questions from an audience. This is one of those subjects everybody's an expert on, and I know in this room many of you actually are. So Beth, let's start the show.
You are here.
Oh.
To correspond with our name badges here,
Yeah.
we'll take the appropriate seat. Okay, let me begin. So thank you so much for your remarks, and thank you especially for being here today. When we received news of your pending departure from Purdue, we, I think, reached out immediately to ask you to be here today, and our plan in doing that was both to celebrate your tenure as president of Purdue and also to learn from you.
Make sure I was really leaving?
Well, of course, we had to make sure, but those other things as well. And so thank you for being here and accepting our invitation to celebrate you today. So just a couple of business details here. So we know that people are eager to ask you questions. The building was buzzing today with excitement over your visit, and I know that the broader education community is interested as well. So we will be taking questions from people who are not in the room today, as well as those of you who are here. If you are watching virtually and have a question, there are two ways you can submit those. First, by tweeting hashtag Mitch Daniels at AEI, or alternatively, you can email Caitlin Aversman, who will forward those to me. Her name is CAITLYN.Aversman@AEI.org. So either of those approaches, and when we get to the last 10 minutes, we'll bring in those questions as well. Okay.
It's already a success. I don't think I've ever been a hashtag before.
Well, congratulations. You finally made it, I would say. So in reflecting on what to talk about today, I recall, you and I first crossed paths several years ago and relatively early in your tenure, in your presidency, and I had the privilege of working with you and your team, sort of advising on an effort that you had to kick off an innovative financing mechanism called income share agreements at Purdue. Now, for context, this was an idea that had largely been relegated to academic texts and the dreams of wonks like myself. Then you came to town and made this thing happen. And so I very quickly learned about your leadership style and what would be characteristic of your presidency, which was that you were going to embrace innovation and also make things happen. These are not characteristics that I generally use to describe higher education very broadly, or even education leaders. So I wanted to ask you, given that this is your style and your existence as a leader, how did you end up in education? What brought you to want to lead Purdue and get into this game?
It wasn't my idea, and I said no to it 2 or 3 times. I thought it was as unlikely as you must have. No, I mean, I'll explain it from a personal standpoint. I finally decided that on the 3rd or 4th overture that I stopped and asked myself, I couldn't think of another job where, other than the one I was leaving, where if a person did a good job, he or she could add more value to the state I care about, the state where I wanted to live, continue living, and perhaps beyond. And by that I meant things like, in a knowledge economy in which the biggest non-military challenge, I think, to our national success is going to be our ability or not to educate, innovate, and continue to lead the world technologically. We have always been what we now call a STEM-centric school, but we've become more so. I thought I saw an opportunity to do more of that. The Augustine Commission had recently issued its report. The piece everybody remembers is that the most important thing that the nation could do to maintain its strength and competitiveness was to produce 10,000 more engineers a year. Yeah. Purdue University, in addition to being 30% bigger, has gone from 41% STEM graduates to 68%. We now graduate more engineers or STEM majors by the conventional definition than any school in the country. And I thought that was a mission worth undertaking. Now, we don't short any other discipline. We've done some things I'm really proud of on the liberal arts, for instance, that we could talk about that are new and different. But that was, I guess, the short answer.
Yeah.
And that hope, I think, it's certainly the opportunity has lived up to it from my end. I hope I've lived up to the expectations of Purdue.
And so when you were invited to be the president of Purdue, I don't think it was a surprise to anybody that you were going to be a change maker there. But I wonder if there were barriers that you ran into, given just that higher education is not a space that has really embraced innovation, and yet that is really a defining characteristic of your leadership.
There are a lot of ironies. If you're a fan of irony, higher ed's the place to be, and there are several. But you just touched on, Beth, on one of the, I think, most obvious ones, that a sector which fancies itself, and in many respects can view itself as very innovative and progressive and so forth, and is in many ways, certainly in the best of our institutions, scientifically, technically, in the whole world of ideas. But in terms of how it runs its own business, it's completely reactionary. And so you're right. It's change is not as easy as you might hope. But I think we've discovered at Purdue that you can make things different, and it does begin to feed on itself. I could give you bigger examples, but I'll just give you one that comes first to mind. Because the sector is so static, a place that does things that are even a few steps out off the track, or a little, or maybe ahead, it quickly attracts the next idea. People bring it to you because they think, what was that commercial? Let Mikey try it. He'll try anything. We're like that.
Yeah, right.
So here, for instance, because we had done a couple of offbeat things, a great little company called Starship brought these robots around. A little white guy that's, about this size, has a little flag that sticks up. They geomap the whole campus. There are scores of them running around our campus all the time. Students, you can order anything from a Starbucks coffee to a full meal, hot, cold, comes, you pull out your phone, you hold it down, pops up the lid, like that. And they brought it to us because we had, I think, a reputation of people who are willing to look at things differently. And so maybe it's not as hard as you think once you get started.
But not everyone liked that, right? I mean, didn't you encounter challenges in bringing all of that change to campus?
Sure, but it may be a little higher, maybe a little more change averse, but this is a human tendency. We certainly in state government, we dealt with it on a daily basis for 8 years. And Robert Kennedy said that all progress depends on change, and change always has its enemies. And we've just learned to try to smile and move our way through it. You have to be prepared to listen to some criticism, accept the legitimacy of some, and try to reason past it, and that's not legitimate, you just have to let roll off.
Right. Okay, so the list of things that you were able to accomplish during your time there is long. What do you feel most proud of from your time there?
Oh, I think the growth of our university that I talked about, without sacrificing quality, is, as a matter of fact, another so-called virtuous circle was that having, it was thought, when I got there, and I thought, that there'd be an inexorable trade-off between size and quality. And that was something to worry about because graduation rates still are not as high as we'd like them to be, even at a place like ours. And so there was a concern that if you let the place grow, you'd be admitting more students who were going to struggle and might not finish. That's not been our experience. The academic readiness of the entering classes has gone up and up and up, even as they've gotten bigger. We know that reputation, we know that the affordability, as it became more and more evident, was a factor. I run into students all the time now from other states, and now more than half of our students come from a different state, and who tell me it was less expensive to come here than stay home. So, this will get me to one other part to the answer. Something else I will always remember with gratitude and pride is we stayed open during the pandemic, and we stayed open with more than half of our classes in person. It was an astonishing experience to go through. It had all the elements you just talked about: fear of change, lots of understandable criticism. People were convinced that we were going to, harm young people, harm adults, faculty and staff, that we were only doing it for the money, a lot of harsh judgments, but through a spectacular collective effort that literally had to involve every corner of the campus and every student, we made it. And that has contributed, we know, to the record. We're going to set another record again this year. It seems pretty obvious for applications. They were 30-odd thousand 10 years ago. We'll have 70,000 this year.
Wonderful. So one of the most celebrated accomplishments is, of course, you achieving the flat tuition over the course of 10 years, which is really remarkable and unseen anywhere else. So for the other leaders who are watching us today, how did that happen? How did you manage to pull that off?
Yeah, I know. This is the must be a trick question. It's a natural thing to be skeptical of or inquisitive. Beth, I've taken to answering it by explaining what we didn't do, because these are quite reasonable suspicions for people to have. So we didn't diminish quality. I talked about that.
Right,
We hired a record number, 213 new faculty this year alone. We didn't downshift to cheaper faculty. We have a 70+% tenure track percentage at our university, one of the highest in the country. We didn't get any more money from the state. It's been astonishingly flat due to the vagaries of the formula that's used there. But that's been okay too. We did not. We reduced the number, and this is a whole other story, of the number and percentage dramatically of international students on our campus. There are 2 or 3 threads to that, but that was a way some schools have made ends meet. And we didn't raid the piggy bank. Our reserves are much higher, 50% higher than they were. So the simple answer is that I believe we were able to achieve alignment around this objective. I love to say that on a campus that, thank goodness, has every stripe of opinion on almost any subject you can mention. One thing I don't find any disagreement about is that we would like Purdue to remain affordable and accessible to young people, to families of all stations of life. And so If you do that, I mean, I get emails regularly from somebody who said, guess, I found a way to buy something, it's going to cost us $25,000 less next year. You know, and we've done a few big things, but it's an accumulation of small expenses and a growth of the top line. And I explained the way in which I think those two things are somewhat related.
Right, so there's sort of a spirit of thrift on campus that spreads as you seek further.
Yeah, well, we have to be dictatorial about it once in a while, but you know, that's it's certainly. I thought at the beginning. Let me tell a story because the first year I hadn't been there very long, and it was time for the annual tuition request, or actually announcement to the legislature, and I said, you know, what would happen? It's been 36 straight years of increases, and please don't anybody snicker because your school did the same thing. I said, what would happen? I've had a look. I think I've penetrated your purposely opaque books enough to say, you know, it looks like we could skip a year, just to send a signal. It was very telling. The very talented woman who was the head of admissions, enrollment, and so forth at the time said, oh, Mitch, you do that. If we do that, people will think we don't have confidence in our product. In other words, I'm back to that point I made about sticker price, that if all our competitors were going up and we didn't, well, there must be something wrong
Right,
there,
something's fishy here, yep.
And I remember saying, oh, now Pam, I said, I just landed here on Mars, this alien planet to me. I said, but back on Earth, I don't think that's what they're saying.
Right.
You know, back there, they're saying, why the heck does it cost so much, and why do they do it every year? So anyway, I did not imagine at the time we could do more than a year.
Sure.
But we did one, and the next year I looked at it and didn't look any tougher, and it's been, you know, become now very much ingrained, I think, in our culture. And as I said, I think with few exceptions, something that every Boilermaker feels good about. I promise you that our alumni are very proud of it. And by the way, I think they feel better about supporting the university knowing the money's not going to be wasted.
Sure, I would think so. Yeah. Okay, let's pull back just a little bit from talking about just Purdue, but want your experiences at Purdue, of course, to inform our discussion. Something that's happening, and I'm asked off a lot about in higher ed right now, is that we're seeing declining enrollments. So between 2009 and 2020, overall enrollment, it declined by 9%.
Yeah.
So this is striking when we would have anticipated increases in enrollment over that period. And we're seeing a lot of it's concentrated among male students. So I wondered if this declining enrollment is something that you had to grapple with at Purdue. You said your applications are at record highs now. And also, what do you think is behind this trend globally, not just how it affects your campus?
Well, that's a great question. It has two or three angles that each deserve some comment. First of all, you're absolutely right. The decline is not recent. It was just the latest one was just reported, but yes, it's been going on for a decade or more. I think it's important to notice there's a compositional difference in here that I think study of the humanities has dropped by half. There's much greater interest in the technological disciplines that I talked about earlier. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
I say this as a fan and a product of the humanities, but it's not. It shouldn't be either surprising or necessarily distressing that more young people today are drawn to computer science and to engineering and to physics and the life sciences and so forth. Those have increased even as it's sometimes masked by the overall decline.
Right.
So I think that's significant. Okay. Secondly, I think there's a perfectly appropriate questioning of whether we were pushing too many young people in the direction of four-year residential college, the most expensive form.
Right.
And I think it's entirely sensible that state, federal governments, and people at large are thinking harder than they were about alternative modes, alternative certifications, and so forth. Now, I'll also say that on the, we are taking part, another thing that we did that stirred a lot of people up for a while, was entered the adult education space. And this is a very well-informed room, so it won't surprise you, but it surprises most audiences I talk to when I tell them that there are more than twice as many adults out there who started college and didn't finish. I'm not even talking here about those who never attempted or dropped out of high school. As there are all the four-year colleges that we pay so much attention to. And so we, in what I've been characterizing as the 21st century land grant mission, the third concentric circle after the original one and maybe the GI Bill and now this one, of our social assignment, we have 35,000 and growing working adults for whom moving to a campus for 4 years or any time is just not an option anymore. But they're achieving that college degree in a different way. So, I think that it's not necessarily alarming that the total is going down as long as we're doing new things, finding new ways to help people grow after high school and frankly, beyond that. Right. You also mentioned the male problem, and that's not new either. You know and I know, but too many people either didn't notice or turned a blind eye to the fact that for quite some time now, the percentage of young men on our campuses has been dropped right into the 40s and now in many cases below 40. I think nationally it's in the 42, 34 range, and that's not a good thing. We're an outlier by virtue of, I think, of our heavy STEM emphasis in particular, but we're one of the few schools where there are somewhat more men than women. But nationally they're not. And I think that the social, the concerns about the societal effects of shiftless or unrooted young men frankly go well beyond the percentage that aren't going to college.
Right.
I think there's some problems beyond that. Our friend Nick Eberstadt and others have really been trying to get the nation's attention on this a long time.
That's right. Right, you talked about one of the potential forces is that people are basically seeking other pathways to career. And I'm really hopeful that the future of education is a bit, embraces more innovative models. And, as you said, you have Purdue Global, which embraces an online education model. What's exciting to you in the space outside of traditional, maybe even beyond, or speaking more deeply about what the online space looks like? And I asked that with the background that I recently had the privilege of sitting here with Representative Virginia Fox to talk about education. And one of the things that she remarked and shared with me was that in the 70s, when she was talking about innovation in higher education, she was talking about the same things that we're talking about when we talk about innovation in higher education today. So I'm curious what you think is exciting and what has the potential to change the landscape.
I think one change that we're seeing now, and I don't think it's going to be either short-term or cyclical, which it has been before, is businesses encouraging and sponsoring and funding education beyond high school.
Yeah.
It's not brand new, but it's big now. In this labor shortage, maybe one of the labor economists in the audience will correct this, but it looks to me like that's not a short-term issue. And if it's not, then what has been as I said, up and down pattern in the past, offer this as a fringe benefit during good times, the first thing you cut when the top line goes down. But we're seeing a lot more of that. Business has always been, as you know, less visible, but a huge part of continuing education, if you just measure it in dollars. And now I think it's more visible because of what's going on in the marketplace. And then it takes all kinds of forms. Sometimes the business is happy to pay for that bachelor's degree or maybe a master's degree, but more often what we see is they're very interested in helping the the electrical engineer touch up or catch up her or his professional skills. So we are active on all those fronts. We offer online education and everything from that associate degree to the 35-year-old single mom who's trying to get to a different job, all the way up to the somebody who's pursuing a professional doctorate to help them in the workplace.
Yeah. And I know that at Purdue, there's a lot of relationships with employers, and that's a core part of the educational experience for your students. In my observation of what works in innovative models, it's often this relationship with employers that generates the outcomes. I mean, can you talk about how that has worked for students, those tight relationships that you have?
I think it's generally agreed across the whole sector that, well, what they call experiential learning, which is, it needs to be more and more ubiquitous. We certainly think so, and we're doing 2 or 3 things I won't take your time with it to try to broaden, and the objective is that every single undergraduate student will have the opportunity to have at least an internship, if not a longer-term job assignment in the area of study. I think it's more and more understood that that's not a nice to have, it's a near essential item. But we'll be announcing soon something I wanted to do for a while, and that is a very major business, and we think they're just the first of several. I've said to them, if you want, you can look at our incoming students. You always come, you come to the job fairs when they're juniors and seniors and so forth. But there's a lot of these young people, you don't have to wait 2 years to know. You can just look at their records and their abilities, and you know now what kind of talent they are. Why don't you link up with them on their way in the door and fund their education, or a big enough part of it that they will agree to spend their summers and take their first job with you.
Right.
We've got our first taker on that, and I think, and when I've described it to other businesses, they're ready.
Yeah.
And so, sort of pulling that relationship back further into the educational experience, I hope will work out really, really well for the young people involved.
Yeah.
And for our business partners too.
That's really exciting. I look forward to following and studying and writing about that. Let me move on to something that has been keeping me up at night, and that is...
We don't want that.
And it's not my children, even though they are keeping me up at night, but let's talk about student loans. And let's talk specifically about the very recent policy effort by the White House to cancel student loans. So you have said publicly that you don't agree with the president's effort to cancel student loans, and I'm hoping you can just give us a summary of that argument of why you don't think that was the right move.
Well, let me count the ways. None of which is lost, I'm sure, on anybody here. First of all, it's regressive. Which is a bad idea. They twisted like into pretzels, trying to find a formula that didn't confer benefits on people who clearly don't need them and aren't going to need them in their lives, and they never did. So there's that. It's to me grotesquely unfair to those who honored their obligations and commitments. We feel this very acutely at our university. Our graduates have paid back their student loans historically at a 99+% rate. I'm not sure how to explain to them that suddenly a cohort has come along that will not be asked to live up to an obligation they took freely. I think that, by the way, I guess I'd put this at the bottom of the hierarchy, but it's important to me. I think that this is a bad moral lesson to send to people, even those who are not involved, don't have a stake in it.
Right.
The moral hazard question has been pretty well developed by others. This is, if the problem, the base problem, as I frequently point out to people, if you don't want folks to be so indebted, don't charge so much in the first place.
Fair.
Seems not to have occurred to some people. But since that is as our friends of a slightly different persuasion like to say, the root cause, okay? Then this is likely to make it worse, as has been described. You know, Bill Bennett identified this in 1987 or so, and it's been validated over and over again that the infusion of more subsidies has maybe 2/3 of it's been captured by the schools in higher prices, and this could happen again. And
Yeah.
now students, future students, may have the sense that they can, that why wouldn't they be excused from some of the debt they're taking on? So I think all those things, there's this minor matter of it violating the Constitution.
Well, there's that, yeah.
You know, we instituted this, starts this year, a civics requirement at our university, starting with this year's freshman class. It's optional for the upperclassmen because they didn't get a chance, but this year's newcomers, it's anytime in 4 years, need to discharge they can meet the test 2 or 3 different ways, attend a certain number of events is one of them, and then take a test which is fundamental, basic civics. But somewhere in that test, there's likely to be a question about an Article I question about who has the power of the purse. And it's not the occupant of the White House with acting unilaterally. No, I just think that it is one of the most unfortunate public policy moves in any area that we've seen. Lastly, it's another several $100 billion. When I said earlier the biggest non-military threat to the country, I almost qualified that by saying that the debts we've accumulated even before the most recent set of 9 and 10 digit splurges.
Yeah.
That's not enough digits, is it?
Hard to keep track anymore.
12, yeah. And so, of course, it's exacerbating that problem too.
Yeah. Okay, so that's enough wrong with it, but I'll say that. But another thing that I like to...
Other than that, I don't have a problem with that.
Well, I do. Allow me to. One of the things I am really concerned about is, of course, constitutionality of it, the unfairness of it. These are issues that, we can't speak enough about. But I'm also worried about what this does going forward. And one of the things I often predict is that it's going to allow institutions to raise prices further. And that's met with skepticism. Some people say, how do you know what institutions are going to do with this, right? The fact that
we know what they did. This is what I was talking about. That you've got several decades now of evidence, and it's been documented. Scholars, the Federal Reserve of, was it Philadelphia? One of the Federal Reserve banks did the, I think, definitive study, and it found somewhere between 60 and 70% of the existing subsidies were captured in higher prices.
Right.
And so it's a perfectly reasonable conjecture that, let's just say this, it's not going to make it any better.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Okay, I want to talk more broadly about accountability in higher education. So the idea of accountability seems sort of central to your leadership style. I recently learned that at the DMV in your state that you get your receipt and it has on it the time that you spent in line, which I think is remarkable and kind of reflects this commitment to accountability and holding institutions to a standard.
Average visit time was 12 minutes, by the way, the last time I looked. So
kudos to you for that.
I've said to friends in Indiana that my tombstone, if there is one, will say, he raised 4 daughters and fixed the BMV.
Which seems like more than enough.
There's an account. Beth, it is a good example on accountability. If you don't mind, I'll just expand on that a little bit. There was when we came to office we were all new crowd. Our team had been out of office a very long time in our state, and I said to folks, I said, we're going to fix everything in sight if we can, but the first 2 things we're going to start on are the Department of Revenue and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Why? Because they touch every citizen, and I said there's rightful disregard for government here. It's a mess. Nothing works, and it'll take us a long, long time to turn all that around. I said, but if we could make those 2 noticeably, provably, visibly better, people would listen maybe a little more attentively to the next idea and the next idea and the next change. You know, you were talking about. So we really went to work on that very, very hard, and within a few years, it was winning all these international awards, and to this day, people bring it up. Visitors or newcomers to our state are astonished, you know, that they have to go, you know, register things, and when it's easy and somebody's friendly, and but you're right. There's a greeter at the door, you know, and oh, Beth, welcome. You know, what do you need? Oh, a commercial driver's license. You want to see, you know, Stewart on line 3, you know, and then when he gives you your receipt, as you leave, it'll tell you how long you were there. And I only take the audience's time because I always thought it was really important to try to build confidence in government. I've always thought that for all our differences and polarity and so forth, one thing everyone should agree on is that whatever the right size, scope, sphere of government activity or government action is, it ought to be well done. If you think more expansive government is a good idea, then you ought to be deeply offended when it doesn't serve the interest. If you believe, as some of us do, in much more limited government, then you ought to really want that government that's there to work well. And so we put a lot of time and effort into that, and it is about accountability. And when I looked back on those 8 years, there was a lot I felt happy about, I guess, but nothing more gratifying than, I think it was your Manhattan Institute, where you once resided, did a national study. How much confidence do you have in your state government? All 50 states. And we were second at something like 77% to South Dakota or somewhere where I'm not sure they need government in the first place. And, you know, but anyway, no, it's a great state.
For the record.
Sorry for a long answer, but you know, you sent me down a trail there that I do think is relevant. It's very relevant to higher ed. Education generally, you know, the struggle for accountability in K-12 education. How long have we been talking about it? How long have people of goodwill been working on it? And look at the recent catastrophic NAEP and ACT results.
Yeah, I mean, absent cloning you or finding these leaders who just believe so deeply in accountability and putting them in place at institutions across the country, how do we expand these emphasis and you know, implementation of accountability on college campuses? Well,
you know, I just when I get the chance, I do try to appeal to people's self-interest, namely that back to the theme I just mentioned, that if you can deliver on those things that either you have pledged or that are just inherent in the job, if you can deliver with some reasonable competence, you position yourself better for the next thing you want to do, or if there's an election for that.
Right.
You know, and but I just think it's too often overlooked by people. Too many people are just thinking about the next zinger tweet or the next splashy initiative, whether it ever happens or not.
Right, right. I mean, is there a role for government to intervene here to put in place incentives for leaders to behave in that way?
Sure. I think that whether it's performance formulas in higher ed that reward, pick your objective. Higher graduation rates, more STEM graduates, whatever you think's important, you can certainly do that. And the system, I think, will move in that direction. Performance pay in K-12 has been a long time fight, and usually these things are countered or by folks who say, well, it's hard to measure. Yeah, it is, but that's not an argument for not trying.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so you're a small government guy, but bigger government in terms of regulation and accountability for higher ed. Are we on the record with that?
I don't necessarily call it big government. It doesn't take an army of bureaucrats, to what it takes. Frankly, it's a job for, like so many things, that should be reclaimed by the legislative branches. That's where policy and standards and things like that should be set.
Okay, great. I want to ask one more question before we turn to the audience for some questions. And this is one I'm not sure I'm allowed to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway because you're in the hot seat.
Never stopped you before.
And what can you do, right?
Yeah.
I want to know what is next. So we were fortunate enough to have your skills in the higher education space for over a decade now. Who is blessed with your leadership in the next phase?
Well, if there were an answer, I would tell you. I honestly haven't made a plan, and life has taken care of itself in the past. Maybe it will again. I've never been a planner. I thought that our students, I love our students. They're very purposeful, and someone has given them the impression they're supposed to have their life planned at age 21. And so I get that question all the time, and I laugh and I tell them, well, you just have to ask the next person because I didn't plan anything.
Right.
And I used to give them the example, it's dated now, but I said, until the night of December something, 2000, when the last Chad fell and finally the election was settled, I said, if you'd asked me right up to that moment, what will you be doing in April of 2015 or 16, I would have said, I'll be retiring from Eli Lilly and Company. That's where I'd spent the longest stretch of my working life.
Right.
And I was involved at the top of that company and enjoying it and completely absorbed in it. And my life changed completely 3 times since then.
Right.
So I always, the reason I tell the students, I say, sure, have a plan, but life's going to bring you're given your talents and your Purdue degree, life's going to bring you opportunities you didn't think about. And some of them might be the right ones. So how was that for ducking your question?
Yeah, perfect. I think it was a perfect dodge. and we'll look forward to following your work and, of course, seeing where you go next. But I think at this point, I can turn to the audience. I know there's a lot of folks who are eager to ask you questions as well. Okay, maybe we can bring a microphone to this gentleman here.
My name is Donald Dakin, and I am a retired corporate lawyer. And I hear a lot about threat to democracies around the world and perhaps in this country. So I'm wondering about how your students learn about our democracy. But you answered my question by saying that you introduced a civics course for freshmen recently.
Yes, Donald.
And so my question is, why did you do that?
Because I had encountered so many students, and the way I like to approach this job and other jobs for that matter was to spend a lot of time on what I think of as ground level. So I've met thousands of our students over the years, and I taught a course in our honors college most years, and I was just struck by how many brilliant young people just had huge gaps in their education. And it's not their fault necessarily. Whatever K-12 system they came through didn't teach them much. History didn't teach them even the basic principles of our free institutions. And there have been so many studies that depict this. By the way, it's not just young people anymore. It's their elders too. So that's what led to our determination to have make sure that at least a modicum of this happens. And as I say, at the end, the student sometime in 4 years has to pass this fairly, I think, basic test. My first idea was let's just give them the citizenship test. If it's fair to ask a Vietnamese immigrant, maybe it's fair to ask somebody who was blessed to be born in this country. In the end, we came up with something that's probably better than that and a little more extensive. But they can either take one of a series of sort of foundational, as they say, courses, or they can attend a prescribed number of public events. I've sponsored a series of eminent people coming through campus, many of them in the area of public affairs, not all, but many. Or there's one other pathway. So I hope it'll at least as I say, I'd like them to leave civic certified so that they're at least have a rudimentary preparation for citizenship. That we're supposed to be turning out something in addition to the best civil engineers in the country. We're supposed to be turning out people who will be productive citizens. So.
Okay, I'm going to turn to a Twitter question now. So you have maintained a strong relationship with your board, but in other places, the relationship between the president and the board is more fraught. Do you have any advice for presidents? And I'll add it in the context of especially those who are pushing the envelope with innovation.
This is really a great question, and so thanks to whoever sent it. I have been very fortunate to have a board and a board relationship that I think has been very productive, constructive, and conducive to moving forward. And I do appreciate that that's not the case in many, many other places. I probably should have mentioned it in answering one of your earlier questions. It's certainly been an enabler. Our board is, first of all, reasonable size, 9 appointed members. We don't elect them. This causes, I think, some problems in other states I'm aware of. And nine members plus a student. The caliber of those folks, the sincerity of their purpose in being on the serving the institution, and their chemistry among them has been terrific for 10 years. Now, I want to say this, I am a strong believer that much of the difficulty in higher education traces to boards who abdicated their rightful responsibilities. I've never read the bylaws of a single institution, public, private, large, small, that didn't make plain that the board of trustees is the ultimate authority over everything, including curriculum and all policies and so forth. And many of them, decades ago, starting decades ago, began delegating that, delegating away, I think, too much of their authority. And I think that was a mistake. And I'll say here, because there are people here, as in many places I go, who are very influential at various schools, and maybe some trustees. And I always say, if you're not prepared to go ask challenging questions along the lines we've been discussing, why are we charging what we're charging? Do we have free inquiry on this campus, or are people reluctant to express their, or even coerced out of expressing their views? Prove to us that students are actually learning and advancing intellectually here. And if we don't know, what are we doing to find out? Questions like that. All that said, I really believe that our board has been fundamental to so many changes, because I don't want to do it on my own. I don't want a rubber stamp board. I want a board who understands what we're trying to do, how we're trying to distinguish our university, and then puts their chop on it. Because it's law then, until some future board changes it. Right. And so I think that's both good governance and the answer to much of what ails us. But I do appreciate that there are many, many places where boards are divided among themselves, or would be reluctant to support changes that, or vice versa, pushing for changes that whoever's president doesn't agree with.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that is a good note for us to end on, and we're out of time, but please join me in thanking President Daniels for his